Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's PACE webinar, Supporting Students' Social Emotional Learning as a Force for Recovery. I'm Heather Huff, the Executive Director of PACE, Policy Analysis for California Education, and I'll be facilitating and moderating this webinar today. I think that every one of you who's on the webinar is very acutely aware of and hearing a lot in the press and amongst educational and policy leaders across the state, the importance of social emotional learning. There was broad consensus around the state and country that social emotional learning was important, was something that we needed to attend to and improve in our educational institutions. And this has become urgent as we consider the types of impacts that COVID-19, the economic and health crisis is affecting students and what types of supports they might need, both now as they're working from home, as we're immersed in crisis response, but then looking forward into the next phases. We'll have a period of reentry over the next several months as we think about how students are able to get back to school and what prolonged education looks like, and then a very long tail of recovery. And in each of these phases, we believe that social emotional learning should be in the forefront of how we design our systems. So for today, we have a great group of panelists who will speak to exactly what this could look like and how we know social emotional learning is so important. So we'll start off with Rick Miller, who will talk about the core districts and their multi-year measurement of social emotional learning. That measurement is the foundation of research that Clint Konopka and Libby Pierre will present that really lays the groundwork for how and why we know that social emotional learning matters and the role of teachers and of schools. And then we'll have Jennifer Peck, the Executive Director of the Partnership for Children and Youth, talk about state level and structural approaches to supporting this. And Maisie Lee from the Sacramento City Unified School District share with us some of the approaches that district level educators are using and considering using as we think about these multiple phases of crisis response and recovery. So just a little bit more about today's agenda. After all of those panelists share their comments, we'll have moderated questions from the audience. So I want all of you to make sure that you're entering your questions into the Q&A box. And just a couple of other logistical notes. When you enter in your questions into the Q&A box, other folks can vote on your entries. And we very heavily use this feature to make sure that we answer live the questions that are of largest interest for the whole group. Slides and links to resources can be found on the PACE event page. So the slides for this event are already up there. The recording will be up there early next week. So without further ado, I am going to hand it off to Rick Miller. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rick.
Absolutely, Heather. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I appreciate joining my fellow panelists. I'm going to talk briefly, it's a few minutes, to walk through sort of CORE's background on this and then really spend time in the Q&A and having others talk about what we've learned. But just as a brief background, let me make sure I've got this. Here we go. Sorry, technical difficulties. CORE basically is a collaborative of 8 large urban districts in California. You can see our members. We have 1 million students, 1,800 schools, and 56,000 educators. And our main purpose of coming together over a decade ago was the idea that districts can learn together and are better together and shouldn't be sort of competing, but actually learning from each other. So out of that, we've gone through several stages where we were just a learning from each district partnership, and then we got a waiver from No Child Left Behind, the only set of districts in the country to get one. And the critical part of that was, as a result of that waiver, needed to create a new accountability model, different than AYP and API at the time. To this point, we built into that accountability model social emotional learning. And our theory was very clearly that we were not taking SEL and putting it into the existing idea of what accountability was. We were actually trying to radically change what we meant by accountability. And accountability to us meant mutual accountability, sharing with each other between educators, and accountability for what matters. And we thought, how you know what a good school looks like, and we thought we knew for sure that paying attention to the social emotional needs of the children in the schools was a critical part of what made a great school. And if we valued it, we thought it mattered, we wanted to be part of the system that we paid attention to. Very clearly, not for top down, we're gonna punish you if you don't get it, but for learning purposes and how do you improve and get better. And then now, sort of in the third phase of core, we are heavily engaged in this notion of systems improvement, how you think about how you become a learner, how you get better at your work, and thinking of SEL as part of that is a critical part of what we're doing. So we also, though, beyond just our 8 core districts, we have a larger core data collaborative where we let any LEA in the state that wants to join us to be part of it. And in there's over 2 million students that are part of this network. And they also then have access to our SEL measures. So we actually have over a 500,000 kids every year that we survey for our SEL measures. And this was, a big deal at the time. I like to say it is the largest measure of SEL in the galaxy. No one does nearly the number we do every year, and it helps us better understand where kids are and what they're looking at. And so the main 4 constructs that we consider are this notion of growth mindset, self-efficacy, self-management, and social awareness. And we started with these 4 because we thought they were the most important beginning places. We ultimately would like to, continue around the castle, if you're familiar with the wheel, but our educators felt like these 4 were particularly helpful. And we'll talk a little more later in the webinar about the impact they've had and our knowledge that you actually can both assess these skills, that it's valid and reliable results, and that it's meaningful and gives you information that's worth noting. And so we'll talk a little more about that. The final thing I'll say before turning it back to Heather is that we are also now heavily engaged in reentry, given our COVID crisis. And we're actually trying to design a new set of surveys that are just sort of not as in-depth, but a spot survey to have an immediate understanding when we get back to school where kids are in their SEL skills. And to be very clear, SEL is a very broad statement. What I mean is like belonging, that they're safe, and that they feel that they can engage in school. How we learn very quickly to give information to educators around that. And also, we're also developing a survey for our teachers, because we actually are equally, if not more, worried about the difficulty that teachers are facing right now. There's a lot of mental health issues throughout the entire society, given what's going on. So making sure we support both our teachers and our students is a big part of what we're trying to build for reentry. And with that, Heather, let me turn it back to you.
Great, thanks so much, Rick. And the measures that Rick laid out really are the foundation of some of the work now that Clint Konopka, a PhD candidate in the Graduate School of Education, is going to present to you all. And the work that Clint will present is highlighting the why of SEL. Even though it's fundamentally, I think, known to be true that addressing students' needs, whole child, is important, it's also important to know that when you do that in a system, you can see real changes in other types of outcomes that we care about. And that's exactly the topic that Clint will be taking up here today. So Clint, if you could hop on video and continue the presentation, that would be great.
Yep. Hey, thank you very much, Heather, and thank you, Rick, for kind of giving us that oversight and very delightful introduction. My name is Clint Konopka. I'm a PhD candidate at the Stanford University Graduate School of Education. And so I want to talk to you all about changes in social emotional learning. So what happens as students grow in their SEL? The thing I want to do first is highlight, I apologize. I want to highlight my collaborators, Susanna Claro, Susanna Loeb, Martin West, and Hans Frick, and really acknowledge that even though I'm the one with the privilege of speaking to you today, this is really a team effort, and all of the results we have and the white paper that you can access when it comes out are really kind of driven by a whole group of researchers. So the background we want to think about is that social emotional learning skills, they're strongly predictive of educational and labor market success. There's a ton of studies, I've highlighted a handful here, that show that when people have high SEL skills or score high on these SEL measures, they have better outcomes. They're going to be earning more, they're going to be doing better in school, they're going to be attending more school. And so we thought this is a really important place to look. And one of the other things that's really important to think about, though, is that there isn't a lot of look at longitudinal changes in SEL and how those longitudinal changes relate to longitudinal changes in other sorts of outcomes. And so the core districts gave us this really great place to look at a longitudinal relationship between changes in SEL measures and changes in student outcomes. And so the questions we wanted to ask are within student changes in self-reported social emotional learning skills predictive of changes in their academic and behavioral outcomes? And the second question, and which I'll get into in a little bit, is do these relationships vary as a function of, things like race, gender, socioeconomic status, previous SEL level, or achievement status? So the sample we looked at is about 49,000 students across 3 school years. So that's going to be 2014-15, 15-16, and 16-17. And we focused on grades 4 to 8 through 5 districts: Fresno, Long Beach, LA, San Francisco, and Santa Ana. We collected measures on 4 independent variables, so those 4 SEL skills that Rick was talking about a little bit ago: growth mindset, social awareness, self-efficacy, and self-management. These are measured yearly, and a thing that we did is we standardized them within cohort year. I'll get into that in a moment. We took 3 dependent variables then too. We looked at math achievement, so this is measured with the Smarter Balance test, the Smarter Balance ELA test, and also attendance rate. These are also measured yearly. And so the reason, if you think back for a second, why we restricted ourselves to grades 4 to 8 and only a couple of years, is that these are the times that we were able to find yearly measures of all of these outcomes and SEL measures for students. And so the thing that we did is we restricted ourselves to students who only showed up in all 3 years that we collected data on. So we have a really good longitudinal picture of this maybe slightly smaller group of students. So the modeling approach we took, I'm going to focus on 2 things that are really key to the research that we did. And the first is that we used cohort year standardized variables. And so these look at student changes relative to their peers. You can think about students are going to get better at math as they go through school, hopefully, and students are going to get better at ELA as they go through school, hopefully. And you would hope, too, that students develop in some particular way on these SEL measures and on these SEL constructs. And so by standardizing within cohort year, we're able to look at changes above and beyond what you would expect for the entire cohort of students that they're in. So do students grow more than their peers, or do students, improve their growth mindset more than their peers? And so this allows us to control those sorts of grade effects and the things that we observe from year to year. The next thing we did is we used something called individual fixed effects. These allow us to control for student characteristics that don't vary with time, things like demographics or school effects. They also allow us to link together observations for the same student over time. And so all of the estimates that we're going to be talking about in a little bit are within student trends. So when an individual student increases their SEL, this is what we expect to see as an increase in whatever outcome we're looking at. So I'm going to tell the story in 4 pictures. The first is, do students actually change in their SEL and all of these other measures? And so this plot may be a little oppressive at first, but let's think about this one step at a time. Each of the different colors relates to a different measure. And so we have growth mindset in blue, social awareness in yellow, self-efficacy in green, self-management in gray, and then SBAC ELA in red, SBAC math in brown, and attendance in this sort of purple color. Along the y-axis, this is how much a student changes year to year. So if students are high, or if you see something extending high on this graph, it means that there was a lot of change in a positive direction. If you see a line extending low on the graph, it's a lot of change in a negative direction. And that 0 line is going to be no change. And then the width of each little sort of colored, we call these violin plots, but each little violin is going to tell you how many students experience that amount of change over that particular time period. And so you'll see is if you look across all of the constructs that students don't actually change all that much, but we do see students that are kind of, 2.5 standard deviations of increase or 2.5 standard deviations of decrease. And so now that we know students change, we want to know what happens when they change. And so the first big finding we have is that SEL growth is associated with better outcomes. So if you look at these 3 columns, we have SBAC math here, SBAC ELA here, and attendance percentage here. And what you're going to find on the y-axis is the expected change in that outcome given a 1 unit or 1 standard deviation change in each of these SEL constructs. And so what you can see is that when students go up in their SEL, that they're also going to be going up typically in their SBAC math, their SBAC ELA, and their attendance. So we see improvement across the board. The next thing I want to highlight, though, is that growth mindset and social awareness, when students increase in those, we also associate that with larger increases in these sort of outcome measures. Attendance percentage behaves a little differently, but that's because it's hard to go from 98% attendance to 99% attendance, for example. So the next thing we want to look at is what happens across different values of SEL. So what happens when students start low or when students start high. On the x-axis, what I've done is broken out SEL by quintile. So 1 is going to be students who start with the lowest SEL, and 5 is going to be students who start with the highest SEL. And we're only going to look at SBAC math from here out because the story with ELA and attendance is fairly similar. The thing I want to point out here is that students who have the lowest amount of SEL to start experience, or we observe in them, larger changes in their SBAC math when they experience the same amount of growth in SEL. And as students start with higher SEL, they're still seeing improvements in their SBAC math alongside their SEL improvements, but they just aren't quite as large. And so the big takeaway here is that for our students who have the lowest reported SEL on these measures, increasing that SEL is associated with these larger increases in these academic and behavioral outcomes that we want to focus on. The next thing we want to look at is what happens when students, when you stratify students across their achievement level. So once again, 1 is going to be students who start with the lowest math achievement, 5 is going to be students who start with the highest math achievement. And here we see a slightly different picture. Growth mindset and self-management, like we saw in previous plots, are still going to be our sort of dominant constructs, but it seems like students experience about the same amount of association between increases in SEL and increases in math achievement across the whole spectrum. The one thing you'll notice, though, is that the position of these changes a little bit as you kind of go across, where, you know, self-management is less important for the lowest math achievers and maybe more important for the highest math achievers, whereas growth mindset is more important for the highest math achievers and a little bit less important for the highest. Sorry, most important for the lowest and least less important for the highest. So the big takeaways we want to talk about here are, first, that gains in SEL are positively associated with increases in achievement and attendance. So when students improve their SEL, they're also improving on their math scores, their ELA scores, and also the amount of school that they're attending. And these associations are largest for growth mindset and self-management. The next thing is that associations between SEL and math achievement vary across the starting levels of SEL that students have. The great thing is that we see the largest increases in outcomes for students who start with the lowest levels of SEL, but the important thing here is that SEL growth is always associated with SBAC math growth regardless of SEL levels. So there's always this sort of positive association between SEL and the outcome. The next thing is that these, the next thing is that these associations vary across levels of math achievement. So all the levels see an association between SEL gains and SBAC math, but different SEL constructs are more associated at different levels of SBAC math, and there's some variability across there. I want to point out that even though I didn't present them, you'll be able to see them in our final white paper, that the results for SBAC, ELA, and attendance really closely mirror what we see in SBAC math. So, you know, we talked about math achievement here, but that holds for ELA achievement, and it holds for students coming to more school. And lastly, I didn't show this plot, but associations between SEL and these outcomes are really consistent across different subgroups. And so the subgroups we looked at, and you can see this in the white paper, are going to be racial subgroups, free and reduced price lunch subgroups, English language learner subgroups, and a couple of others. And so with that, I want to thank you all for your time, and I want to hand it back to Heather.
Great, Clint, thank you so much. So a couple of housekeeping notes. I know some of you are having trouble accessing the links in the chat box. So if you go to the PACE homepage, which Sean will put into the chat box now, from there you can access the event page here, and we have slides there and also related publications. You can also from that page access the topic of social emotional learning, which contains all of the research that the Core PACE Research Partnership has done over the past several years on social emotional learning. So the pieces that Libby and Clint are presenting here today are part of a much larger set of studies that's designed to understand the SEL measures and to validate the measures, but also to unpack what some of the practices are at the local level, excuse me, that influence student scores. So just a pitch to go check that stuff out if you haven't already. And this piece that Clint presented is not yet published. This is research that's hot off the presses and was a little bit delayed due to the onset of the pandemic, but will be out in the next month or so. So what you're seeing here is a preview of a publication which we will send out to all of you when it's ready in the next month or so. But transitioning to Libby, part of what Libby is going to raise up is building off of Clint's research that shows the impact of social emotional learning on future outcomes. What is the measurable role of classrooms and of schools? And so again, because these measures are the first of their kind at this scale, we're able to do this kind of analysis, and Libby will share this with you all now. Libby?
Thank you, Heather. Good to be here, everyone. My name is Libby Peer. I'm the research manager at Education Analytics. We are a nonprofit based in Madison, Wisconsin, and we serve as the analytics partner to the core districts. Today, I'm going to talk to you about 3 different studies that we've conducted looking at school and classroom level effects on students' growth in SEL. And before I get into the results of the studies themselves, I'm going to take a few minutes to explain what a growth model is. And that's because the results of the studies that I'll share with you rely on estimating school level and classroom level growth models of SEL. So a growth model is a statistical approach that we use to measure the effect that a school or a classroom has, typically on students' academic growth from one year to the next. But we can apply this same statistical methodology to measure the effect that a school or a classroom has on students' growth in SEL from one year to the next. We start this process by collecting the SEL survey data that are administered to students in the core districts. We scale that student data so that we assign a scale score, much like you would have a scale score on an assessment like SBAC. And we determine average growth based on each of the 4 SEL constructs separately for each grade level and demographic adjustments. So the way this might work in practice is that for each individual student, we determine a customized statistical prediction based on his or her characteristics. So this could include things like an adjustment based on how similar students performed based on prior year SEL scale score, adjustments based on the student's particular characteristics, as well as adjustments based on the characteristics of the school that the student attends. And all of those together would be taken into account to make that customized prediction for that student. And I'll just note these are example numbers, nonsense numbers just for illustrative purposes, but that in practice, the numbers are based on actual data. The next thing we do is determine whether each student exceeded their prediction or didn't meet their prediction and by how much. So for example, the student on the left scored higher than we predicted by 5 points, whereas the student on the right actually scored lower than we predicted by 4 points. The next thing that we do is look at how a school or a classroom did on average in terms of their students exceeding or not meeting their predictions. So for example, school A on the left, students on average scored 3¼ points higher than we predicted. Whereas school B, students scored on average 1¼ points lower than we predicted. So the interpretation is that school A had above average SEL growth that year, whereas school B had below average SEL growth that year. And in the final step, we can take the results and convert that to some kind of scale. For example, a 0 to 6 scale, where a score of 3 would imply a school had average growth in that year. And we can do the same type of process at the classroom level as well. So first I'll share what we've learned about school effects on students' growth in SEL based on these growth models. First, we look at essentially how much variability there is in these school effects. So what we find is that effects that schools have on growth in SEL are actually similar in size to effects that they have on growth in academics. So what we're looking at here are growth results from 2 years, 2016 and 2017. What you're looking at on the vertical axis is the standard deviation, which tells us how much variance or variability there are in these estimates. And variability is good in this case because we want to be able to differentiate schools that have above average growth in SEL and schools that have below average growth in SEL. This red line here is based on math SBAC growth. The yellow dotted line is based on ELA SBAC growth. SBAC only goes through 8th grade in this case, although we administer it in 11th grade. We're looking at growth measures here that compare performance in the prior year and performance in the current year. And what we can conclude is that on average, the growth estimates from SEL models are similar in terms of the variability compared to growth models on math and ELA. We also looked at how stable or how correlated these growth measures are from one year to the next. So for example, would a school that had above average growth in SEL in one year also be likely to have above average growth in SEL the following year? You can focus mostly on the top panel here. This is correlations that adjust for how much measurement error there are in these measures. Below are without these corrections, but you can see they're virtually identical. So just focusing on the top panel here, each point is the correlation separate for each grade, which you can see at the bottom, for our growth measures from one year to the next for math, ELA, and our 4 SEL constructs. And you can see overall these correlations are mostly positive and significant, but they tend to be on the low side, particularly for the 4 SEL measures. So what that means is that although we can capture true contributions that schools are having on students' growth in SEL from one year to the next, a lot of the effect that a school has is unrelated from one year to the next. And I'll talk a little bit about the implications of that at the end. Next, I'll say very briefly what we've found about effects at the classroom level. So this table is trying to answer the question, how big or small are the effects that classrooms can have on students' growth in SEL? So a couple of things that I want to point out here. First, there is a measurable impact that classrooms have on students' growth in SEL. The raw numbers here give you a sense of the magnitude. The percentage gives you a sense of the relative proportion of how much of the impact we can explain at these 3 different levels. So compared to the classroom level, we actually can explain less variance at the school level, which suggests that there might be more of an impact happening based on the classroom that a student is in compared to the school that they attend. But an important thing to note is that a lot of the variability here isn't explained by the classroom or the school that students are in. It's explained by other factors, student individual differences, or other things that we don't currently include in these growth models. And this is true even more so for the 4 SEL constructs compared to math and ELA. So even though you can see that the magnitude of the effect is similar at the classroom level between math and ELA and SEL, the proportion that's explained at the classroom level is a little bit lower for SEL than math and ELA. One other thing that we were interested in looking at is whether or not classrooms where students grow a lot in SEL are the same as classrooms where students are growing a lot based on math and ELA SBAC results. So what we're looking at here are correlations. That's the number that you see on the top. In parentheses is the standard error that gives us a sense of how much confidence or precision we have for those estimates. And in general, these are 5th grade classrooms that we're looking at where students have the same teacher for math and ELA. So in those classrooms where students are growing a lot in ELA, they also tend to grow a lot in math. But classrooms where students are growing a lot in math or in ELA aren't necessarily the same classrooms where students are growing a lot in SEL. We see a much lower correlation between the SEL measures and the ELA and math measures. And what this suggests is that there's something important that these SEL measures are capturing about positive classroom environments, positive classroom supports, and potentially good teaching that's helping students grow in SEL, but that we can't necessarily capture based on math and ELA SBAC scores, which suggests that there's something really important to try and learn and try to assess about positive things happening beyond just standardized academic assessments. So a couple takeaways here. We find that schools and classrooms can measurably affect and do measurably affect how students grow in SEL from one year to the next. And classrooms we see have a larger impact compared to schools. We've also found that the impact that schools have isn't that stable from one year to the next. One potential reason for that might be that students change classrooms from one year to the next, even if they stay in the same school. And so if more of the impact is explained at the classroom level, that could be one reason why we don't see as much stability at the school level. But that's something we're hoping to look at in the future and be able to compare how stable classroom effects are across years. The general conclusion is that these measures aren't ready or appropriate to be used for high stakes accountability because of some of the features that I talked about, the lower stability, the lower explanatory power of the models, but there are a lot of useful applications that we think they're appropriate for. Things like identifying those schools that are consistently high or low growth in SEL across years for continuous improvement purposes, and identifying classrooms that are consistently high or consistently low growth in SEL for professional development and ongoing learning. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Libby. So I think that it's probably clear to folks that have been listening, and if not, I want to make it very clear that what both Libby and Clint were presenting is not the testing of a particular intervention or set of interventions, but rather trying to understand the impact of students' social emotional learning on other outcomes, or the role of teachers, classrooms, and schools at scale. And so this is looking across all of the students in the core districts over time to understand at scale what is happening. But really, we all want to know, what can people on the ground level do? How can schools, districts, and other support systems help to advance this? And so this is where we've brought in both Jennifer Peck and Maisie Lee to talk about the kinds of practices, interventions, and structures that will be helpful in moving students' social emotional learning as a way to support their learning, their academic learning. So first, we're going to ask Jennifer Peck to present and share some thoughts on both the importance of social emotional learning and the types of structures that can be built to advance it. Jennifer Peck is the Executive Director of the Partnership for Children and Youth. Jennifer.
Thanks, Heather. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk about some of the broad system implications of what we continue to learn about the value of social emotional learning. So one of the reflections I have on the research that's been presented that I find really interesting is that for the schools and the classrooms that were studied, we don't really know the quality or depth of the SEL practices or the level of integration that's taken place. We just know that the educators in these classrooms and schools are doing some kind of SEL. So given the results, a conclusion you could draw is that even if some SEL is introduced, even if it's not fully refined or integrated, it's positive. So that's really interesting to me to consider. What I think we don't want to conclude from this, for example, is that we can just bring in an SEL curriculum but not look at the overall learning environment and the relationships between adults and students. Or we don't want to conclude that we can just implement a single practice like a morning check-in, but not integrate SEL into academic instruction. Our belief is that this work is both about the skills we want kids to have, like self-management and social awareness, but it's also really about the fact that learning doesn't happen without emotional connection, which we know very clearly now from all the brain science. So the intentional relationship building and connection amongst adults and between adults and students is the critical foundation to the explicit skill building work. One of the things that my organization spends a lot of time thinking about is how to bring a comprehensive approach to implementing SEL to scale in our big and diverse state. And it's been really interesting to observe the evolution of SEL interest and activity in California over the last decade or so, which in many ways was inspired by the work of CORE and calling out SEL in their federal waiver all those years ago. And since that time, there's been a ton of increased activity around SEL that's mostly been developed and led by educators out there around the state in classrooms and districts. And there's been a lot of innovation and expertise that's been developed in corners of the state. But pockets of good work and innovation don't on their own bring anything to scale. It was because of this challenge that the California Department of Ed launched an SEL work group that convened from 2016 to 2018 to start to think through what the state's role ought to be in getting more SEL guidance and supports to educators. And this helped us start to look at what other states were doing to build SEL awareness and systems of support. And some good tools were developed during that time, like California's SEL guiding principles, which articulate a list of the things that are really important in this work. And if you haven't seen those guiding principles, I really recommend you check them out on the department's website. So that effort was a good starting place, but that work hasn't yet, at least through our formal system of support, turned into more specific organized guidance and professional learning around SEL, which is what needs to happen. And outside of MTSS, there really hasn't been any specific state investment in this work that's played out. So I would say our biggest challenge in California around advancing SEL remains that the ways in which implementation is happening, access to technical assistance, access to tools and information, all continues to be pretty uneven. And right now, as we're in the middle of COVID, as has been referenced earlier, the demand for SEL supports and tools has really accelerated given what kids and educators are experiencing and the extreme levels of disconnection out there. And I think there's a lot of recognition that distance learning, just like classroom learning, needs to lead with relationship and personal connection, which SEL practices help facilitate. But doing this remotely is a whole new challenge. And this lack of coherence in our system right now and getting SEL supports and resources to educators broadly and efficiently is a particular challenge at this moment in time, and one that many of us are feeling a lot of urgency around. The good news is that we have a lot of assets to leverage here in California, and while additional state investment is important, it's probably not realistic at the moment. So we have to focus on leveraging the knowledge and the assets that we already have. And I think there's some ways that we can do that. For example, some county offices of education have started county-wide or regional SEL communities of practice so that educators can learn from one another, which is a great way for knowledge and resource sharing to happen. Sacramento County Office of Ed has been doing this for several years without additional resources, and they have brought in practitioners from around the state. They've brought in national experts, and they encourage folks to come in teams so they can have shared learning and planning time. One thing we have learned from this approach is that the county office does not need to be an expert in SEL to play this role. They just need to be willing to convene and broker resources. And we think more of this can and should happen all across the state. We have a number of districts that have done great SEL systems work over time and done so with existing resources. And you're really lucky to be hearing from MyC from Sac City right after this. Many of these districts have worked really quickly to integrate SEL into their distance learning. So we need to identify and share these resources in an organized way so we don't have to reinvent this work in 1,000 school districts. County offices can play a role in this sharing, so can the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence and some of our other statewide associations that have reach. There's also a lot of resources being offered by a range of organizations that develop curriculum and tools, et cetera. But I think a very big challenge right now that we're all experiencing is this volume of stuff that is coming at us in our inboxes, the list of distance learning resources, all the webinars, and it's tough to know what's worth digging into with limited time and limited resources. We are attempting to curate some of this. CDE is starting to curate some of this, but identifying the right resources and tools could also really be expedited by more facilitated peer-to-peer exchange that I talked about before, because people want information from a trusted source. And I'll just end with a plug, which is that CDE just put out a call for applications for participation in a new SEL work group. This is the 2.0 version of the work group that CDE convened previously. And I really encourage interested people to get engaged and help inform how the state is thinking about its role in supporting SEL capacity. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for your comments. I'd like to now introduce Maisie Lee, who's with the Sacramento City Unified School District. Maisie, can you please turn on your video and share with the group some of the types of great work that you all have been working on for many years in Sacramento City Unified School District?
Yes, I'm on here. Can you see me?
Yeah, we can. We see you.
Okay, thank you. And so thank you so much for having me here today. I am deeply honored and quite humble to share our work in Sac City. I think for us, social emotional learning is about creating levers for equity. And so, you know, the mantra that my team and I talk a lot about is how do we store up so that we can restore too. And I think folks have talked about this idea of social emotional learning being grounded in relationships, the way that we are connected to our students, the way that we are connected to each other, the way that we are connected to our community, our parents, our partners, starting from our leadership on down to our classrooms. So for us, it's truly about creating this systemic approach to how we really facilitate teaching and learning so that all of our students and our community members can thrive. So I want to be clear that when I talk about social emotional learning, I'm not talking about an intervention strategy, while it can be. I'm talking about the way we show up and the way we show up to engage with each other. So I just want to make sure that that was clear. So first of all, in Sac City, it's been about how do we prioritize social emotional learning, especially during these times of great uncertainty and great anxiety. And I think Jennifer spoke to this idea of this plethora of resources that are popping into our inbox. And so being really thoughtful and careful about what we put out so that the resources are both understandable and accessible to our families. So when school closures were announced, it was really important for my team and I to come together and to be really thoughtful about what resources would be of most value for our families and our students and staff. So we quickly curated some resources that we put on our webpage. We also knew that with distance learning, social and emotional learning was going to be needed. And in fact, we needed to lead into learning with social emotional learning. So we created a framework to integrate SEL into academic teaching and learning in our essential standards folders, modifying them, of course, for virtual and online platforms. For our students, again, understanding that our students will experience distance learning and COVID-19 with a varying degree of emotions, trauma, supports, and connections to adults. So we curated a variety of lesson plans that allowed students to select topics that were of relevance to them. So these are self-directed, self-paced lessons that also get at that multi-tiered systems of support. And so we're using a platform called Ripple Effects to help deliver those lessons to our students. And then again, understanding that our adults in the system are also struggling. This is truly uncharted territory for both our leaders as well as our teachers, and certainly for our parents who are also supporting distance learning on the home front. So we have a daily self-care activity as well as mindfulness practices and additional self-care practices that we have offered for our community. And then lastly, what's been a super fun project and one that was really aimed to bring our community together, again, in these times of uncertainty and great stress, we put together a podcast where we offer weekly tips on how to practice and SEL competency, as well as bringing in diverse voices that represent our community, so that we can begin to really deepen our sense of empathy, connection, and belonging to each other. Because once again, SEL isn't about the curriculum that we deliver on Monday at 9 o'clock for 30 minutes. While it is that, it is so much more. And so we wanted to make sure that our community was cared for and that they stayed connected while they're physically distanced during these times. You know, and then in thinking about moving forward, back to this idea of store up to restore to, I think these are opportunities for us to pump the brakes, to take a pause, to take a check for really how are we leading. So for leaders to really think about how we're leading in these times, because when we re-enter, how we respond, how we collaborate, how we communicate, how we connect to those under our care will be of tremendous value, because we will not be returning to normal, right? This time, this experience will have forever changed us individually and as a community. So how do we reimagine a new normal? And reimagining a new normal where SEL leads the way, but really thinking about our students who are on the margins, who right now, as we speak, some we're not able to locate, right? Who right now, as we speak, depending on their relationships or existing relationships with their teachers, there's great inequities in the way that they are attended to and are connected with and cared for. And I keep thinking back to this Margaret Wheatley piece around leadership being about hosting and not being about heroes. So I would just think that from leaders to classroom teachers to the adults in the system, that we really think about ways that we lean into each other as a collective and really cultivating this collective efficacy to be in relationship with each other and to really move forward again into this new world, knowing that we may not know where the other side looks like, but as long as we stay together and stay connected and really looking out for each other, that we will be okay. So, you know, I think returning will be, I think, all about SEL on day one. And in fact, I would say that social emotional learning needs to carry the day for a few weeks when we return, because people will come back with a range of experiences and emotions. Some will be relieved and joyful and excited. Some will be grieving and angry and frustrated. So understanding that all of those emotions impact the way students learn, the way teachers teach and show up for their students are going to be really critical. So creating rituals and daily routines that we are checking in with each other, where teachers are checking in with students, where principals are checking in with teachers, where leadership is checking with their principals, will be extremely critical in the way that we attend to the trauma that we will have had experience that has touched all of us in the new world, and really just making sure that we have those rhythms that are positive, that are about making sure that we care for the people first before we focus on the content.
Thank you so much, Mycie. And I would like to ask all of the panelists now to get back on video and to be prepared to answer some audience Q&A. So audience, thank you so much for all of your really thoughtful questions. We're gonna answer as many of them as we can during this time, and some of them have already been answered in the Q&A. So the first set of questions that I'm gonna consolidate really is for Mycie and Jennifer. Lots of people are asking questions about interventions, especially in the context of the research that Libby and Clint presented that kind of shows the overall effect, but not necessarily drilling down into what each school is doing and how could we measure that or think about measuring it. But I think even more broadly, there is a question if this work is relational and not about a curriculum or a particular set of things that are implemented, how then do you spread it? how do you know if a school is quote unquote doing SEL if it's not measuring the amount of minutes that a kid is getting exposure to something or the intensity of an intervention? We had a lot of comments along these lines, and so I'd love for the two of you to weigh in on that question.
Jennifer, would you like me to take it? So, you know, it's interesting because I think that is in our journey, the area that we need to get better at and we need to grow in. What we have done in Sac City is implement the school-wide climate survey that will give us, well, similar to the data that was presented today, including some of the indicators that are presented today, along with belonging and safety. And that then the data is aggregated by school. So we have a sense of how students are experiencing SEL. We have a sense of how adults are experiencing SEL and connectedness and belonging, as well as parents in the way that they are experiencing engagement and learning and connectedness. So that gives us some idea of what's happening at that school and how students are growing or not growing in their sense of connectedness and belonging to their peers and to the adults that are caring for them. The other thing is we do have coaches. Fortunately, in Sac City, Sac City has invested in a team to support our schools. And our coaches regularly look at discipline data, and they also work with our chronic attendance people to also look at attendance data and really regularly engaging with principals on doing a data study so that we're continuously looking at ways that we can use data to inform how we can support our adults and our students. And then the last thing I will say is that in our work with CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, there is a walkthrough tool, a SEL/climate walkthrough tool that is available to schools, to districts, to really go in, engage what is happening, how are skills being developed, what curriculum is being taught, how are adults connecting to their students, what does it look like in the hallways, feel like, what vision is there, and is the vision communicated in a way that everyone understands what is expected of them in terms of engaging in a socially and emotionally healthy way.
The only thing I would add to that is, as Maisie said, there's a lot of overlap with what schools are already looking at around school culture and climate. I know that some schools are pulling data from the California Healthy Kids Survey to help look at this. And I want to link this back also to the value of creating the peer dialogue space, whether it's at a school, within a district, within a county, for folks to actually talk about what they are learning, both from the data and from their observations about the school environment and the relationship environment, so that they can discuss and troubleshoot and address those things together as peers. I think that the space for that is absolutely critical. And then I would just reinforce also the resources that CASEL has. They've been convening an assessment work group for a number of years and have created, I think, some really good tools for the field.
Thank you so much, both Jennifer and Maisie. That I'm going to follow this idea about measurement and data, and Rick and Libby, these next questions will be for you. There were a number of questions in the chat box about why we measure and how people use these measures. And so I'd love for the two of you to talk about both what these measures do and don't tell you, and how they're packaged up and shared so that people in a classroom level, at a school level, at a district level can act on them. And then also what sort of considerations you bring in thinking about how and why you present data.
Libby, do you want to start? You want me to go? Okay. So, yeah, so thanks, Heather. So I think, if I'm being really blunt, when we first started this in the Waiver Day, it was really, we wanted to learn about the information, we want to understand, and our theory was if we build it, then we can begin to have folks like Maisie and Jennifer and others come in and actually do the work. And Sexy has always been a huge partner with us in sort of moving it forward. So that was sort of our theory and really where we have been going. But I do think that this next phase is sort of thinking about how it's used in the classroom and for what reasons. So for instance, as we're thinking about this new COVID-19 survey we're looking at, one thing that really concerns us and drives our thinking is how actionable this data is. And what I mean by that is that, it takes a village to raise a child sort of thing. I fear that we're now saying the entire village lies within a single teacher, that teacher needs to be a counselor, take care of their home. We do like sort of every single thing. And if we give a bunch of SEL data that a teacher has no ability to deal with, what have we actually sort of done? So thinking about how we do this in a way that is actually actionable and that we make sure that we have all the education system actually be able to use this in meaningful ways to help kids, we're going to have a huge amounts of trauma returning to us, and being thoughtful about how we're ready to deal with that is something we're thinking a lot about.
Yeah, I think I'll just add on to say we think a lot about the importance of reporting and displaying data, a lot of different kinds of data, and for different users. The frequency and granularity of data that a teacher needs to see is really different from what a school leader needs to see and what a district administrator or leader needs to see. And that's an ongoing challenge too, to really be able to understand not just what's available, but what's appropriate to report and how frequently and in what format. And we've started to do more work with CORE in particular to think about how do we start bringing those data directly to families and students as well, which adds a whole other layer of the appropriate and responsible way to report these kinds of measures. I think in general, our mentality is that data can be a really powerful tool to help drive equity. There's always going to be potential misuse. And so we try to be really particular about what we think various measures are and are not appropriate for. So for these SEL measures, we think we've done a lot of work in collaboration with PACE and lots of other researchers to establish that they do have strong reliability and validity for particular purposes. Things like looking at trends in the aggregate, things like looking at the kinds of changes that Clint presented on today, and being able to identify these consistently high flyers or consistently schools or classrooms where there might be a need for more support. But we don't think that they're reliable and valid enough to make high stakes conclusions about resources or high stakes conclusions about remuneration or payment. So I think it's important not to throw all possible uses of the measures out the window only because they're inappropriate for some. And it's our responsibility to help communicate what those appropriate and valid uses are.
Thank you so much for that, Libby. And it sounds like looking forward, and many of the comments in the chat box are addressing this, we do need to be thinking about how we measure things like remote engagement and student need, especially now and when kids are coming back to school in the fall. So keeping that framework about what data is good for different uses is really valuable. So with just a couple of minutes left, I want to pose a question to Maisie and to Jennifer primarily. We're in a really odd practical time right now in California where teachers are administering content remotely, and parents to a large degree are the ones who are spending so much time with their own kids in an instructional context. What types of advice do you have for parents about how to address students' social emotional needs at home? What can we learn from research and practice from the before pandemic phase to try to bring into parenting and crisis schooling?
I'll jump in quickly. I've been thinking about this a lot as a parent of a public school kid. And I think a lot about the importance of SEL for the adult, which we talk a lot about in this work. And our organization actually does a lot of supports for staff who are working with kids in public and affordable housing. And all of the training we've been doing in that context has shifted from supporting staff to supporting parents and caregivers, for the very reason that it is really hard to take care of kids unless we are taking care of ourselves and our own social and emotional needs, which are so intense and real for so many people. So I think trying to figure out the resources that we can provide to parents and caregivers that is accessible to them, I think Maisie alluded to this earlier, and we'll talk about it more, is so critical right now. I think finding things that are really accessible to parents is difficult, and doing so in a culturally responsible and equitable way. And I'll look forward to hearing a little bit more about how Maisie has addressed this, but I really think that piece is really, really important to, I don't need more information as a parent on how to tutor and provide the academic support so much. That's not going to be my expertise, but if I can care for myself socially and emotionally, I'm going to be a much better support to my child.
All right, Maisie, you get the last word.
Oh, great. Thank you. So just to add to what Jennifer has already articulated beautifully, I think it's about giving yourself permission to be okay with your kids not logging on every single day, right? We chatted with some students who recently said, I just don't have the motivation. I miss that physical social connection that helped me to be motivated, to lean into learning. And I don't have that, so it's really hard. So I think as a parent, it's okay that right now attending to your students' mental well-being, their emotional well-being has to take priority. And I don't mean to dismiss all of the wonderful work that our tremendous teachers are putting into posting online. But again, right now, and I've said this is the one time in history where we are not assessing, right? We are not assessing academic standards. So we can give ourselves grace and permission to also be a little bit more focused on the social and emotional well-being of ourselves as well as our students. And I think for parents to just have that permission to feel, permission to just say, it's okay, we'll take this minute by minute and day by day. And it's hard, it's challenging, but we just have to remember to care for each other, to care for ourselves, and to have hope that this too will pass.
Thank you so much, Maisie, and all of our panelists. It's such a note of hope to leave us on today. Thank you for the participants for joining us on your lunch hour today, and I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.